One person benefits from a government shutdown, and that person is Donald Trump. Why would he want the government to shut down, especially on his watch? Well, first and foremost, shutting the government down means that the House cannot bring to the floor a vote to release the Epstein files. Nobody wants the Epstein files to remain hidden more than Donald Trump.
The most brutal takedown of Donald Trump doesn't come from a rival politician, a journalist, or even a late-night comedian. It comes from Mary Trump, his own niece, who knows where the skeletons are buried because she was practically raised in the graveyard. Her analysis doesn't need cheap shots or exaggeration. Donald Trump provides all the material himself. Mary simply hands the world a mirror, and the reflection is less leader of the free world and more family embarrassment turned global spectacle.
Because of Donald Trump's failures to understand how the Senate even works, because of his failures as a leader, and because the Republicans refuse to compromise with Democrats in order to come up with a bipartisan budget agenda, the government has shut down for the first time since 2019. If that sounds familiar, well, guess what? Donald was president in 2019 when the government shut down, and it was the longest shutdown in modern American history.
Mary Trump doesn't waste time painting him as a misunderstood genius gone wrong. She paints him exactly as he is, a man who built his empire on a foundation of insecurity and coated it with a cheap layer of gold paint. For decades, he has chased applause like oxygen, mistaking noise for respect and mistaking loyalty for love. In her telling, the president isn't a titan of politics. He's the oldest child in the room, desperate to prove something to a father who never gave him the nod he craved.
And then, of course, there's the fact that in a government shutdown, economic data will not be released. So the American people will not hear about the horrific jobs report. They will not hear that inflation is once again on the rise because of the failed economic policies of one man, Donald.
Her roast slices deeper because it's laced with context no comedian could invent. She explains that Trump's obsession with winning isn't about leadership or vision, but about avoiding the humiliation of losing. Every campaign rally, every attack on opponents, every tantrum over polls is the grown-up version of a child flipping the Monopoly board because he couldn't stand to lose. Except this time, the board isn't Monopoly, it's the United States, and the pieces are millions of lives shuffled around for the sake of his ego.
So, let's take a look at what NBC News has to say about this latest development.
And the government has officially shut down. My phone is blowing up with statements from Democrats and Republicans already trying to point the finger and play the blame game so that their side does not get blamed by the millions of Americans who will be impacted by the consequences of this.
Mary highlights how every presidential misstep is rooted in a personality that never learned accountability. In the Trump family dynamic, failure was weakness, and weakness was unforgivable. So he grew up unable to admit mistakes, unable to handle criticism, and unable to accept responsibility. That's why in moments of crisis, instead of clarity, he offers confusion. Instead of solutions, he offers scapegoats. Instead of humility, he offers grandstanding. The Oval Office hasn't changed him. It's only given his dysfunction the biggest stage on Earth.
The blame game, of course, is in full swing, despite the fact that this is clearly to be laid at the feet of the Republicans in Congress. But Democrats and Republicans are pointing the fingers at each other. Even before the shutdown began, Republicans were blaming Democrats for the shutdown without any evidence that it could possibly be their fault.
When she tears into his pandemic performance, it's not the usual critique of mixed messages and mismanagement. She points out the psychology behind it. Trump didn't see a public health crisis. He saw a public relations crisis. He didn't measure outcomes in lives saved, but in applause sustained. Every bizarre press conference, every reckless dismissal of science, every desperate attempt to brand the pandemic as something it wasn't was just another chapter in the lifelong struggle to spin failure into victory. The tragedy, Mary notes, is that this time the cost wasn't just his reputation, it was human lives.
Republican Party is in control of every single branch of government. The executive branch, the legislative branch, and the judicial branch. They control both houses of Congress, the Senate and the House of Representatives. In what universe can anybody lay this at the feet of Democrats? Well, Republicans are going to do their damnedest trying. But let's look at it this way. It is the Republicans' bill. It is the Republicans' budget. So why won't Democrats go along with it? Well, because this is the Republicans' negotiating stance, which, by the way, is exactly the same as Donald.
She skewers his obsession with appearances, too. The man who never met a mirror he didn't love governs as if approval ratings were the only metric that mattered. Policy isn't about impact, it's about image. Diplomacy isn't about alliances, it's about photo ops. He can intimidate. Even military decisions look like scenes staged for television rather than calculated strategies. Mary describes it as a presidency built like one of his casinos, flashy, loud, and bankrupt the moment you look at the books. The most cutting part of her roast is that she doesn't frame him as an outlier. She frames him as the inevitable product of a family culture obsessed with dominance, wealth, and appearances. Now, as president, the same traits that made him unbearable at the dinner table make him catastrophic in the West Wing.
Donald and the Trump regime are not known for ceremonious firings. For instance, former FBI Director James Comey found out about his firing from seeing it on the news. Others have found out that they were fired from their posts on Twitter. Yes, firing people via tweet. That was a thing during the first Trump administration. Now, sources say a number of FBI agents are set to be fired in a very disrespectful way. A mass midnight email.
Mary Trump mocks the idea of him as a self-made man by laying out the receipts of how he was propped up from the beginning. The loans, the bailouts, the tax schemes, all of it turns the myth of rugged individualism into a punchline. He didn't build an empire. He inherited one and then nearly set it on fire while bragging about how brightly it burned. The image of him as a business mastermind collapses when even his niece describes him as someone who couldn't survive 5 minutes without a safety net woven by others. She doesn't stop with the financial delusions. She digs into his emotional fragility, the kind of fragility that makes him demand loyalty oaths from subordinates and lash out at anyone who questions him. That's why he clings to yes men, why he dismisses experts, why he turns governing into a family reunion where only the most sycophantic relatives are allowed in the room.
As we know, the economy has been suffering under Donald's questionable stewardship. Everything he's done when it comes to economic policy since January 20th of this year has made our economy worse. Last month alone, in September, over 30,000 jobs were lost. It is not supposed to work that way. This shutdown is going to make everything worse. In fact, it's going to cost the United States economy billions of dollars per week, according to a new
What makes Mary Trump's roast so devastating is that it doesn't come from malice, it comes from observation. She dissects him clinically, as both a relative and a psychologist. Where others see chaos, she sees patterns. Where others see randomness, she sees repetition. Every outrageous statement, every reckless move, every moment of confusion in his presidency traces back to the same insecurities she grew up watching at family gatherings. The tragedy is that what was once a private dysfunction is now a national burden. And she twists the knife by reminding the world that Trump's obsession with legacy will backfire spectacularly. He dreamed of monuments and portraits. Instead, Mary ensures he gets punchlines and paperback covers. Every miscalculation, every overreach, every meltdown is another frame in the comedy she didn't write but simply documents. And the fact that it comes from inside the family makes it impossible to dismiss. This isn't political spin, it's lived experience.
The law enforcement agency that protects Americans against terror attacks, child pornographers, and gun runners. And it raises the question, how will they use the resources that remain to protect everyone everywhere?
Well, simple. They have no interest in protecting everyone everywhere. The goal here is to purge law enforcement of anybody who is not completely loyal to Donald and the agenda of the Trump regime and the fascist.
Her roast lands hardest because it destroys the illusion that Trump is untouchable. For decades, he has silenced critics, sued detractors, and bullied opponents. But Mary Trump isn't an outsider. He cannot rewrite her testimony. In the story of his life, Mary is the unexpected narrator who strips away the glamour and leaves only the absurdity. The sting of Mary Trump's words comes not from exaggeration, but from precision.
She doesn't inflate his flaws for entertainment. She simply dissects them with the steady hand of someone who has seen them all her life. The irony of a man so obsessed with appearing strong being undone by his own fragility is almost too poetic to believe. Her perspective slices deeper than
Any comedian or commentator, because she places his behavior within the context of family dynamics. She doesn't see him as a one-off spectacle. She sees him as the inevitable product of a toxic household where cruelty was rewarded and compassion was dismissed as weakness.
Because of Donald Trump's failures to understand how the Senate even works, because of his failures as a leader, and because the Republicans refuse to compromise with Democrats in order to come up with a bipartisan budget agenda, the government has shut down for the first time since 2019. If that sounds familiar, well, guess what? Donald was president in 2019 when the government shut down, and it was the longest shutdown in modern American history. So, let's take a look at what NBC News has to say about this latest development.
And the government has officially shut down. My phone is blowing up with statements from Democrats and Republicans.
What others mistake as random outbursts or inexplicable decisions, Mary frames as predictable reactions from someone conditioned to equate domination with survival. The presidency didn't change him. It amplified the dysfunction that had always been there, now projected onto an entire nation. Mary Trump's roast lands with particular force because it turns his myths inside out. He has long sold himself as the master of success, the self-made mogul, the man who conquered business and then politics. But she reveals the scaffolding behind the illusion, the loans, the bailouts, the endless interventions that kept him afloat. To the outside world, he marketed triumph. To his niece, he simply wore a costume stitched together by other people's efforts. In her telling, the empire he brags about is less an achievement and more a family inheritance mismanaged into a spectacle. When she dismantles his obsession with loyalty, it's not a political critique, but a personal one. The result wasn't leadership. It was an echo chamber so fragile it collapsed under the weight of reality. What makes her roast so cutting is that she recognizes this was never about governance, but about replicating the family hierarchy where dissent was crushed and obedience equaled survival.
Well, that's what happens when the person in charge is a thin-skinned bully who has a good memory when it comes to one thing. Remembering his slights, remembering people who did things he didn't like, remembering people who stood up against him. Donald never forgets a grudge. And that is where we are.
Her analysis goes beyond the headlines and digs into the psychology of performance. Donald Trump didn't just run for office. He auditioned for a role he never truly understood. To Mary, every campaign rally and every presidential address was less a statement of policy and more an episode of theater, designed for applause rather than substance. He didn't crave progress, he craved the spotlight. And in mistaking attention for achievement, he transformed the presidency into a stage show where the scripts were sloppy, the acting was wooden, and the drama collapsed into farce. Mary also exposes the futility of his relentless branding. For decades, he plastered his name on buildings, planes, steaks, and even bottled water, convinced that repetition could substitute for substance. But in the end, the name Trump becomes less a mark of prestige and more a punchline. Her revelations ensure that future generations will associate it not with grandeur, but with absurdity, not with vision, but with vanity. By revealing the hollowness behind the label, she doesn't just roast her uncle, she rewrites the meaning of his legacy in permanent ink. The brilliance of her takedown lies in its balance of comedy and tragedy.
The state
On
does
one
not
hand,
need federal
she
troops.
sketches a man
Our city
so
is a far
consumed by
cry
insecurity
from
that
the
his entire
war-ravaged
presidency
community
reads like
that
an
he has
overlong
posted about on
sketch
social
comedy
media.
routine. On
And
the
I
other,
conveyed that
she
directly
reminds
to him.
us that the consequences were real,
But how can that
the
be?
chaos tangible,
If Donald
the costs
says that
immeasurable.
Portland is war-ravaged, it must indeed be war-ravaged, mustn't it? Well, KGW Portland reports that Oregon officials claim that Donald has been misrepresenting conditions because he's been citing inaccurate news coverage. For instance, Fox has been showing videos of Portland protests that occurred in 2020 in the immediate aftermath of George Floyd's murder.
The brilliance of her takedown lies in its balance of comedy and tragedy. On one hand, she sketches a man so consumed by insecurity that his entire presidency reads like an overlong sketch comedy routine. On the other, she reminds us that the consequences were real, the chaos tangible, the costs immeasurable. This duality makes her critique sting all the more, because it is funny until you realize how much damage the performance inflicted. The bloopers may make for laughter, but the reality they masked leaves scars that history won't forget. What separates Mary's words from the noise of late-night jokes or political jabs is their permanence. She doesn't lob one-liners for applause. She documents dysfunction for posterity. In her telling, Donald Trump's presidency won't be remembered for achievements or reforms, but for missteps, contradictions, and a never-ending hunger for validation. But Mary Trump guarantees the opposite. He will be remembered, yes, but not as the hero he imagined. He will be remembered as the cautionary tale that his own niece laid bare for the world to see, a cautionary tale wrapped in bravado, undone by truth, and sealed forever in ridicule.